Hey, I thought we'd do something a little bit different today. Here on this podcast, every episode I ask my guests for a book recommendation. I ask them if there's something that they've read recently that they think is worth sharing about. And there's a few reasons why I do that. I think it's nice. Books travel through word of mouth. So I thought, hey, it's the end of the year. Maybe you're looking for a gift for someone that you like, or like me, you take the holiday season as just a time to read and catch up on a bunch of books that you've been putting out. So rather than asking people what books they like, I thought, hey, why don't I give you my recommendations of books that I've read this year that I think you should check out. So first up, Utopia for Realists by Rutger Bregman. There's a lot of really cool stuff in here. I'm an optimist at heart. I really think that people can make the world better, and we sort of have. He kind of opens this book saying, in the past, everything was worse. People died of disease. There was child mortality. Overall income was lower. People didn't have as nice of a life, basically on average, as we tend to have today. And so he talks about this idea that utopias were these things that people tended to go towards. And if you go back to like the 1400s and you look at what their utopia was, it's in a lot of ways what we have today, where like kids didn't starve to death and people were able to do roughly what they wanted, which is, you could argue, what we have today in a lot of ways. And so Bregman makes this argument that, well, we should keep dreaming. We should keep striving to go for some of these utopias, and this is what he thinks we should go. So he argues for a bunch of things like universal basic income, and because productivity is going up, we should work less hours. There's a lot of really cool things in here, and I thought it was an interesting read. I am an optimist, but sometimes struggle to find the arguments to justify like why. And so the reason I read is to get exposed to ideas. I don't necessarily read book summaries. I like sitting down with a book, and it lets me sit in these ideas for a while. So this is a good book for people that want to know, like, how do we make the world a better place, and what are some good arguments for doing that? So I'm going to follow up with a second book, which is called The Capitalist Manifesto by Johan Norberg. And it's a bit of a similar basis in that the world is getting better. The world is getting richer. And there's a common thread here that basically, on average, there's this graph from the UN that the development index of humanity, basically like how developed and how satisfied and maybe not happy, but like overall well-being of people is going up over time in the world on aggregate. It doesn't mean that some people's lives is getting worse. It doesn't mean that there aren't wars. It doesn't mean that there aren't epidemics. It means that if you take all the humans that are alive today and you compare it to all the humans that were alive 100 years ago, and you compare on average their life, the humans of today are doing better. And so both of these books sort of have the same status, start from the same point, but they approach on what do we do next in very different ways. I'm an optimistic, I've mentioned that, but I also think of capitalism as this interesting thing that I feel like I don't quite fully understand, and from what I'm hearing from a lot of people, there's probably some misunderstanding as well. And so this is an interesting read. This is someone that says capitalism is what we should go for, and the subtext of this book is why the global free market will save the world. So kind of gives you a taste of what this book is about. And I thought it was really interesting because I want to have arguments for saying, like, yes, I think capitalism at its basis, which is people make stuff and they own the product of it. And people are free to do what they want. They're free to build things or provide a service that other people will pay them for. And so at its most simple, it's if I provide something but my neighbor provides something that's better or cheaper, why would you buy it from me? You should go buy it from them. It's going to make me want to make my product better or cheaper, and then that's basically the premise of market. There's a few things in this book that he touches on. He touches on not just capitalism, but open markets. So why countries should open their borders. We shouldn't have necessarily nationalism, as in, I want to produce my things locally because it's better. And so he sort of looks at countries that have done that and countries that have on the contrary, being more open. And on average, over time, the countries that are more open tend to end up doing better. And so this is an interesting premise because it gives arguments for one way or the other. And that's what I'm looking for in reading. I didn't necessarily agree with everything that he has, but the reason I read is because then I can pick and choose the arguments that I like. So there's something about, for example, big tech corporations like Facebook or Google or Apple, and he makes the case that like we should regulate, or people make the case that we should regulate these companies because they're getting more and more power. And he says, yeah, on the one hand, yes, but on the other hand, these companies are very recent. If you look at other tech companies, there's things like AOL and Yahoo, things that have basically died out. And yet, at the time, AOL was considered like untouchable. You have other companies like IBM. If you look back in time, people were under the impression that these companies could just never fall. And yet, they just didn't take the turn of innovation. They didn't provide value in a way that other companies were. And so inevitably, that's why they fell. It's not because someone regulated them. And you need things like antitrust. And he talks about the fact that like there are loopholes today, which means that the modern implementation of what we have has some flaws and we need to address them. But the flaws aren't sort of capitalism itself. And I think that's an interesting premise because, look, I do this podcast and I do these things, but I also work at a tech startup. And I've done so my entire career. I've worked at tech startups. And there's a few reasons for that. First, I think startups are a really cool place to work when you're younger because you can do a lot of stuff. But also, I think that's where a lot of the change is happening. I think that's where a lot of the, hey, I have a cool idea, let's try to implement and see if it works, happens really quickly. You have a lot of iteration cycles because there's not a lot of people. You can build a thing, you can go to a customer and ask them, are they willing to pay you for it? And it's yes or no. That feedback loop is very quick for startups. And I also think that's where innovation comes from because you can have a small number of people that are very opinionated about something, try a bunch of stuff. And that's why a lot of them fail. But that's a good thing because it means we're trying a bunch of new things. So at its core, if I put my money where my mouth is, my money is in working at tech startups. That's how I make a living. This is cool, but it's a side thing for now, at least. And so for me, it was important to understand what is the premise behind capitalism. And beyond people saying it's terrible and it's evil, like I hear that a lot and I empathize with it. I wanted to hear good, well-reasoned arguments for, yes, but why is it sticking around and why should we advocate for it, basically? So these two books back to back are quite interesting because they're sort of coming from the same place of the world is getting better and we should strive and we should demand that it keeps on getting better. But they come at it from different approaches. One of the big takeaways I'm getting from the Capitalist Manifesto is the idea of inequalities. I think inequalities have become a thing that we should tear down. People shouldn't be unequal. And I hadn't heard this argument, but what he says basically in the Capitalist Manifesto is that's the wrong thing to focus on because in a way, if we look back at this curve of human index over time, you're still better off being middle class today than a king in the 1300s because you would still probably die very young and most of your kids would die around pregnancy or before they were 5. If you had any health issues, you couldn't go to the hospital. There was no surgery. You had access to probably not that great food, even as the wealthiest and richest person in the world at the time. And so he makes this argument that like, it doesn't matter if there are people that are that much richer, as long as everybody lifts up over time, that's what we should thrive for. And he makes the argument that capitalism basically gives us things like fridges and washing machines and cameras and microphones and YouTube and the internet where I can just directly talk to you like this. And even if someone got insanely wealthy doing that, it trickles down to a lot of us. We sort of get to a point where we completely take it for granted, and then we focus on the things that aren't equal, and the things that we want better. And we should totally focus on the things that are better, but this is an interesting argument that I hadn't heard necessarily well formed before, that like inequalities in themselves, they're not necessarily a problem, because people work in unequal ways. And so that's also another thing about capitalism, is that as long as you sort of do the work to live enough, to have enough to live for, like you don't have to try to innovate the next thing. Like you don't actually have to. There's some limits to that though, of course, which is what do you do when people get to an age where they can't work? And so you sort of need welfare. Or what happens when someone has an accident and they can't work anymore? Like how do you take care of people like that? And so like there's a lot of criticisms that you can have to these systems, but the reason I read, once again, isn't because I agree with these people, and it's the same reason why I have people on this podcast. I don't have people that I agree with on the podcast. That's not what I go for. I go for people that have something interesting to say, and books are sort of another way to do that. It's someone that has these ideas, they put it out there, and they say, hey, this is what I think, and so what I'm doing here is sharing. I think these people here have interesting things to say, and this is why. And if you're curious, if you're interested, you should read that. So, Capitalist Manifesto, second book. When I read that, there was another book that I had in mind, which is The New Breadline. And I had Jean-Martin Bauer, the author, on this podcast. We did this in person here. And Jean-Martin Bauer was the World Food Program director of Haiti for a couple of years. He's worked at World Food Program for 2 decades, and he wrote this book this year that came out, The New Breadline, about hunger. And in the Capitalist Manifesto, he makes this argument that open borders are overall good. And immediately there was this poll in my head from The New Breadline, in which Jean-Martin Bauer talks about how opening food imports in Haiti in, I think it was around the 80s and then the early 2000s, basically wiped out the local food production because there were food subsidies in the US. So food was produced so cheap, and even with imports were produced so cheap that the local farmers could just never economically compete. And so it just wiped out all of food production in the country. And so over the long term, you had at first aid that came in to relieve hunger, but you create these dependencies on food imports. It means that the country on itself doesn't actually stand by itself. And so you might be thinking, okay, well, imports are bad. We should close and we should just create local economies. And that's why I read these different books, is because it's not as simple as that. And Jean-Martin also talks about basically hunger and food as these really complex problems that have not easy solutions. And so I recommend reading probably these books together because they approach it from different angles. The New Breadline is also about how hunger has this way of just creeping back into people's lives. It's also a thing that I think is in the common zeitgeist. A lot of people think we should solve world hunger, and there's a lot of comparisons of these people have this much money and this is how much money it would take to solve world hunger, or we've invested this much money in these sorts of projects that seem like they go nowhere where we could have put it in world hunger. And Jean-Martin makes this case that like it's not just we put money one time and the problem is solved. In the Capitalist Manifesto, he has this point of view as well, that there is this comparison of like, oh my God, Jeff Bezos has this much money. If we gave it to people and we spread it back and we redistributed to the world, actually it wouldn't be that much money. I think he makes this argument that if we gave all of Jeff Bezos's wealth and we gave it to every human on Earth, they'd basically get 2,000 euros or dollars one time. So you basically wipe out the whole wealth and you gave $2,000 one time and then nothing. And like that actually doesn't change people's lives that meaningfully over a huge amount of time. It's still a lot of money, but like those are interesting things to put in perspective. And hunger is a little bit the same thing. Like you need to eat your entire life. It's not about injecting money one time. And Jean-Martin talks a lot about how also tech has this sort of savior complex sometimes where we think, okay, new technology is going to solve this problem and then it's going to completely disappear. And he says, like, we need new technologies because, well, refrigerators have made a great improvement in people's lives in terms of what they can eat. You can eat a more varied diet because you can put food in your refrigerator and your freezer. So it does help, but it doesn't solve all the problems. And if you want a deeper dive into what does it take to actually solve world hunger, I have had Jean-Martin on the podcast to discuss some of those stories. Some of those stories are pretty personal as well. And I really recommend his book that came out this year. Next up, I want to talk about science fiction. And I want to talk about Cixin Liu's, no, this is not the first one, The Three-Body Problem. This is the first one. This is a 3-in-1. It's a trilogy. There's 3 books. They end up being pretty bulky. But the first book is the shortest, so it's a great introduction. They're good stories, like all of that praise for like it's a really good story. But beyond that, what I really think makes this book and this series worthy is sort of the ability for good writing and good science fiction to expand your horizon of what you think is possible. So if I go back to Utopia for Realists, he makes this argument that in the 1300s, people couldn't quite imagine what the world would be like today. They'd had this idea of utopias and they would dream about it, but realistically, I don't think the humans that lived at that time could completely really comprehend what it was like. And I think science fiction is sort of the tool that we have to try to imagine, roll the clock on what a future world would be like. I think they're the tools that help us daydream and hallucinate about what future worlds would look like. And so finding good science fiction allows you to imagine a world that feels so far-fetched that it's just not comprehensible to the world that we have here, but it leaves you, at least it left me, thinking about, okay, what if the world ends up like this? It sort of provides a wider viewpoint on what the world might look like, and so what our day-to-day might lead up to. And so this is what I think is some of the best science fiction, in my opinion, because it's rooted in, I think people refer to it as hard science fiction. So it's rooted in the physics and in the rules of the world. There's not a magical element that comes out of nowhere that you can very handily used to explain away a lot of what's going on in the story. It's still rooted in very physical terms. I mean, it's called the three-body problem. If you know a little bit about orbital mechanics, like it's a real thing. And it's incredibly well written. It's rooted in real physics. One of the things I appreciated the most is that it keeps on delivering. What I mean by that is there are stories where fantasy is I think guilty of that quite a lot. You have a opening book which is all about world building. Here are the rules of the world and here are the characters in it. And you sort of get thrown into this world and you dream about it and you think about it. And then the following pieces of the story are all about the events that unfold. And so you start off with a bang with something amazing that blows your mind, and then it's all about the intricacies of what happens. And it can sometimes feel like it sort of diminishes in sort of the intensity of the story, at least for me. These books, they keep on delivering. The world keeps on getting crazier and expanding. By the third book you finish, it seems like the first book is basically just scratching the surface of what's going on. I can't recommend these enough. They've had a lot of praise already. If you're into reading, you've probably heard about these. I want to recommend them for that ability to expand your possibility. I also think the fact that it's written by a Chinese author, a lot of the story is from a Chinese-centric point of view. I particularly appreciated that. I'm European, I'm not from the US, and so a story that isn't about the CIA found this thing and the FBI got involved for the millionth time is actually quite nice. It's just a different point of view. It makes it real. Another example of that comes to mind is Andy Weir when he wrote Project Hail Mary? No, one of his books, I forget which one, maybe the second one, Artemis, is about Kenya becoming the biggest spacefaring nation. And it's just nice, like, to think about other places in the world sort of becoming the center of these futures rather than always the US, even if I think most likely in the direction we're heading in the short term, the US is still ahead in a lot of things. It's just another nitpick, interesting part. There's a bunch of Chinese history and culture in there. It's just very well world building. So I'm actually recommending the first one to get started, but honestly, you get 3 for the price of 1. All 3 are incredible. They're worth your time. They're worth your money. They're really good. I have them here. And also they make for like really good book stands for your other books because they're pretty bulky and big. But I haven't watched the series. There's a Netflix series. There's also a Chinese series, apparently. I've heard that the Chinese original series is better than the Netflix series, but I haven't watched the Netflix series, so do of that what you want. Just read the book. It's really good, especially for like holiday season where you want a bit of just like leaving the world behind you and just getting lost in a world for a while. This is wonderful. All right. Back to sort of reality. When the Heavens Went on Sale by Ashley Vance. I also had Ashley on the podcast, so I'll have a kind of link to that conversation with him. This is basically everything that happens before. How do we get here in the 3-body problem? Like, these are the people that are building the things that feel like the science fiction of tomorrow. Ashley Vance is probably most known for being the first biographer of Elon Musk. That was one of his first books, I think. And then he wrote a second book about still the aftermath, not of SpaceX and Elon, but about all the other companies that got inspired by SpaceX to also go build aerospace companies and startups. And it's a story of what it takes to build companies, of what the future of the aerospace industry worldwide might look like, and who the people that are building it are. So if you've listened to any other episode of this podcast, I like talking to people and understanding what goes into their minds. Ashley Vance is just marvelous at doing that. It's also incredibly funny. And at the same time, it's quite hard to do that because people are, putting their life savings and just pouring themselves into these projects and can feel very tense at times. And this is just really funny. Ashley is a really fun guy as well. The conversation I had with him was amazing. It was one of the most fun of the year. If you're in the aerospace industry, if you're interested in satellite images, in what might be coming next, I really recommend reading this book. It got me excited about working in this field all over again. I just sort of devoured the whole thing. It's the story of 3 rocket companies and one company doing satellite images called Planet Labs, which was the one I was the most interested in. A company that's doing satellite images. They basically said, hey, why don't we strap smartphone cameras onto cheap satellites and just send that to space and get a whole bunch of satellite images. There's a lot of really cool stuff. It sort of ties well with the Capitalist Manifesto. There's some interesting things because I also want to hear about some of the national programs. So in the Earth observation satellite image world, there's a lot of what we have are public programs like Landsat, like Copernicus. These are programs funded by public programs. They put all their data out for free. And there's this tension between the private sector and commercial sometimes, and where innovation and more data and more information comes from. This is an interesting point of view to see and understand some of the frustration that comes from the public sector and why some of these people started these companies, but also the limits of doing that. There's a documentary that Ashley Vance also produced called Wild Wild Space. It follows specifically two of these characters in the story. Peter Beck from Rocket Lab and Chris Kemp from Astra, about building these rocket companies. There's a little bit of Planet in there as well. I recommend both. The book is great as an in-depth read. The documentary is a lot more approachable to anybody. And it's just a really good time. And there's something about like actually seeing the people. Reading what they said is one thing, but seeing people and hearing it from their own words is another. All right. Next up, this year I read for the first time Into the Wild by Jon Krakauer. This was one of those moments where I realized I have changed my mind on a big topic that was a big part of my identity growing up as a teenager and a young adult. I never read the book before, but I had watched the Sean Penn movie when I was like 18. And I think like a lot of people, I got high on this idea and really embodied this idea of like, I think this guy has got everything figured out. So if you don't know the story, basically it's the book is an investigation into trying to figure out what happened to this man called Chris McCandless, who in the 90s was in the US. He left his life behind. He had a few tens of thousands in money saved up, and he all just gave it away to charity. And he went wanting to go to Alaska, and he tried to go to Alaska, and he met a bunch of people along the way, and quite tragically he died. He passed away in the winter, probably starving to death. And it did a lot of headlines at the time. Krakauer was a journalist writing for Outside magazine, I think, so he was a column writer, and he wrote the story about what happened to this kid at the time. It got a lot of attention, and so he wrote this whole book about trying to know a little bit more in depth about who this guy was, why he probably did what he did, and understanding who the people around him were. And I think there's this common narrative that when you're sort of becoming a young adult, it's an appealing story of someone who rejects the modern world and says, I just want to go live in the woods again. And I really felt that. And I'm grateful for seeing that at, 18, because I went traveling and for cheap and like just a backpack. And I did a lot of these things because I was inspired by that story. But the movie Into the Wild isn't about piecing the story. It's about telling the story of Chris McCandless. So you're not seeing sort of the whole process that Jon Krakauer went through. You're seeing just the bits about Chris McCandless and his life, basically. And it's a beautiful movie. It's incredible. But I'm glad that the book is it's written in the first person. It's quite personal about Krakauer's journey. And he's probably the best person that could have written this book because he was a mountaineer. He also wrote Into Thin Air about I forget exactly which year in the 1990s, the Everest sort of tragedy where a lot of people ended up dying on Everest. So he's someone that's spent a lot of time outdoors, and he tells you how he pieces together this story. He talks to Chris McCandless's family and people he met along the way. There's pretty little judgment in what Chris has done. There's some people that thought he was completely reckless, and because he puts himself in danger and doesn't really think about his family and like the impact on other people that he puts, he was self-centered and very reckless. But then there's other people that are like, he escaped sort of the rat race of the modern world and he sort of had it all figured out. And like most things, it probably lands somewhere in the middle. But Krakauer says when he was younger, he went through some of those same things. He went to Alaska on his own. He went to climb an ice wall and nearly died there a couple times, and then went back, and sees himself a lot in what Chris McCandless has done. He talks about how Krakauer himself could have very well have had an article written about how he was this reckless 20-year-old that died in Alaska, because he very well could have been. He escaped barely death a couple times on those trips, and then he came back and sort of changed as a person and got married and had kids and sort of reflected on that and spent a lot of time with people on the outdoors. So it's not just someone reporting on this other person that they can't relate at all. It's basically someone reporting on a younger version of themselves that had a tragic ending. And at the end, finally, he sort of reflects on that and on that story. And I realized that I changed my mind on how I feel about this character, this person, Chris McCandless, as I've changed as well. I don't think I'd want to do something like that. I don't think I'd want to be reckless in that way because there are other people around. I think there's other ways that I'd want to contribute. I think there are problems that we need to solve, and going away for a bit is helpful. Like, we need some of that, but then coming back is also quite nice. So this is a book that isn't new, like doesn't need necessarily more attention to it, but it's been around for a really long time. It was written in the 90s, so it's sort of like faded away a little bit. I recommend reading the book. I recommend watching the movie, but the book is probably what led me to have a lot of thinking about what do I want to do in my life, and how do I want to live my life. So again, a lot of things to take away from it, a lot of things to think about. I don't really fully know what I think of this whole story, but I know that it made me think a lot. And that's what books should be about. I took some time to go on a bike trip and just read and bike all day for a week. And this was a helpful book to do that for. Just go away in nature for a little bit and just think about people who've done that and had much worse fate than me. There's a final book that I want to recommend, which is The Little Prince. I don't have it here, but you can find it anywhere. The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, a French author. I do have another book from his, which is Night Flight. And a couple months ago, I sat down with my friend Jed Sundwell, who runs another podcast called Texts on Texts. And he interviews people that are working in the field of tech and asks them about books they've read that have influenced them. And for me, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry is someone that has had a pretty big influence on me and still continues to. And The Little Prince is probably what you know him for. It's this sort of children's book, but actually not really children for children. About a whole lot of topics. It's written in very simple, plain language. It's very approachable, but it's about love and friendship and meaning and not taking yourself too seriously. It's very short. You can read it in a couple days. It's one of those books that I read over and over again every few years. Rather, I read it every once in a while. So I've read it multiple times throughout my life. And it's a book that I try to come back to every once in a while. It's a book that helps me sort of detach myself from the day-to-day worries sometimes and just gives a bit of reflection in very simple terms about what we're all here to do and just the meaning of loving someone. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry is also someone that I think is very interesting in the sense that he's most known for this book, The Little Prince, but at its heart, he was an aviator, someone who wanted to fly planes, and who also wrote about it. The Little Prince is a book that never probably was meant to be written in the first place. His publishers and editors never asked him for something like this. His readers never wanted anything like this, and yet it's the last book that one of the last books that he wrote, and one that he was, it seems, the most passionate about writing. even if it's completely different from everything else that he's written. And so that's why I'll throw in another one, which is Night Flight. We talk about it with Jed. We made a whole episode about that. If, again, at Christmas you go for a long walk or a run or a bike ride and you want to listen to something and two people nerding out about a book, I'll have a link towards that. This Night Flight is about the Aéropostale, which was this aerial post in France all the way started in France, went along the coast of Africa all the way down to South America. And these people that put their lives and their whole meaning of what they're doing towards delivering airmail. And it's actually a story about startups in a lot of ways, about what it's like to build modern companies today and be fully devoted to it to a point where it looks over the top to the outside world. These pilots in the 20s would, put their life on the line to deliver airmail. It's a story about communication before there's anything even remotely close to the internet. So mail was the way you communicated around the world. There's a lot of really interesting things, and Saint-Exupéry writes it from the point of view of it's a fiction, but it's based on his own story of being a pilot, being dedicated to it, having these really hard managers that were here to get the job done sort of no matter what. There's a lot of interesting reflections in there. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry is someone that I relate a lot because he was both working in the world that he's in. He was an aviator and he writes about airplanes, but he's also an author and he writes about that world, and he writes when he's not flying, but he also flies so that he has something to write about, and he wants to write about things he knows about. And a lot of it felt to me similar to what I've been trying to do over the last few years through this podcast, through some of the more edited videos that I've tried to do, where I want to talk about the field that I'm in, but I also want to be a practitioner in the field that I'm in, so I'm not just talking about it, but also doing it. And there was a lot of relevant points that I found personally towards that. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry is also French. I'm French, so there's some places that I've been and spent time around that Antoine also has. So it's just a personal point. I think these books are just great, especially if you don't read French. There's translations. The Little Prince is like the most sold book ever after the Bible. I'm sure you'll find it somewhere. It's actually quite insane that this book is the most sold book ever, and like only the Bible is about it, the Little Prince. I don't know why. We talk about it with Jed if you want to go check that out. So here's books that I recommend to read, not because I agree with them, not because they're perfect, but because I think they provide something valuable, and that's probably worth your time. I also recommend taking the time to read. I very rarely read book summaries. I like reading a book because it means that for the foreseeable few weeks or months, I'm in the headspace of what the ideas of this book are. Especially for nonfiction, I think there's this tendency to want to say, let me distill the main ideas of this book, and I don't need to read the whole thing. I can read like a 5-10 bullet point. I think that's helpful to weed out which books are worth your time or not. But at the end of the day, I think like people recommending books and why you would do that is still a way that I hear about books and decide which ones to read. I ask people which books they would recommend on the podcast because that's how I end up reading these books. Most of these, actually, probably like half of these came from recommendations from people. So hopefully that was helpful for you. If you want to get a gift for someone, give you some inspiration. If you hadn't heard about these books and you want to go spend some time over Christmas and the holidays to do that, maybe it gave you some ideas. And I'd love to hear if you have some. Just leave them in. If you're on YouTube, there's a whole bunch of comments that you can put there. If you're listening to the podcast on Spotify now, you can leave comments. So please do that. And otherwise, there's links for where you can reach me in the comments, in the description, in all of that, depending on where you're listening or watching that. Thank you so much for listening. This is a bit of a different format. It's just me. Let me know what you think about that as well. It's kind of nice to do this. I quite enjoyed this. I don't know if you will. If you're still around, I feel like maybe you got some value from it. Let me know. Maybe I'll do some other stuff like that. Yeah. Thank you so much for spending some of your valuable time with me. And hopefully you'll find some new books to read. I'll see you next time. Cheers.